Man loses his job. Security walks him past his own coworkers, carrying a cardboard box with his desk plant and a photo of his kids sitting crooked on top. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the lawyer he had humiliated for years would take the fall for his mistake. He was wrong, and I was the reason. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they were smarter than you, someone who ignored your warnings, mocked your advice, and then tried to make you the scapegoat when it all fell apart, this story is for you. Stay till the end, because this is the story of how one quiet decision saved a career and ended another. My name doesn't matter for this story, so let's just say I'm a lawyer. I was pushing 40 when this happened, with more than 10 years in the trenches of legal practice behind me. Contract disputes, insurance fights, the occasional trial that kept me awake for weeks straight. I'd learned most of what mattered the hard way, but there was one lesson that stuck with me more than any other, and it came from an old-timer I worked under as a summer student, fresh out of my second year of law school. He was gruff, half-retired in spirit if not in title, and he didn't waste words. One afternoon, over a cup of burnt office coffee, he looked at me and said something I never forgot. "A lawyer has 3 duties," he said. "First to himself, second to the court, and last the client." I remember blinking at him. Wasn't the client supposed to come first? Isn't that the whole point of the job? He just shook his head slowly. "Clients will screw you," he said flatly, like he was stating the weather forecast. "They'll throw you under the bus without thinking twice, if it saves their own skin. Remember that, kid." I was young. I thought I knew better. I left that old lawyer's office for a flashier downtown firm, chasing bigger cases and a nicer view from a higher floor. I've been downtown ever since, but that lesson rode along with me for the next 15 years, tucked in the back of my mind like a spare key I hoped I'd never actually need, until the day I needed it. My client was a mid-sized company, the kind that doesn't make headlines, isn't listed on any stock exchange, but quietly owns a respectable pile of real estate and a handful of other assets. Solid, unremarkable, the kind of client that pays its bills on time and doesn't cause drama. I liked working with them, mostly because they left me alone to do my job. One day, one of their buildings burned to the ground. Insurance claims like this are exactly the kind of thing companies hire lawyers for. 6 or 7 figures on the line. Insurers looking for any excuse, any technicality, any delay tactic to wriggle out of paying what they owe. The company assigned a file to a man named Frank. Frank was pushing 60. A career company man, the type who'd been doing the same job so long he'd quietly convinced himself he could do anyone's job better than they could. He didn't think he needed a lawyer for this. "I've got it handled," he told me, more than once, in that tone people use when they've already decided the conversation is over. Lawyers, in Frank's world, were an expense to be avoided at all costs, a leech on the budget he personally guarded like it was his own savings account. I want you to picture Frank clearly, because it matters for what comes later. He was the guy who'd argue over a $14 taxi receipt for 10 minutes. The guy who bragged in meetings about how much money he'd saved the company by, quote, not bothering the lawyers. Every time I dealt with him on other files over the years, it was the same routine, nickel and diming me over every invoice, questioning every billed hour like I was trying to rob him personally, treating legal advice like an unwanted sales pitch he had to politely sit through. So when the fire happened, Frank didn't call me. I only found out by accident weeks later, when he mentioned it in passing on an unrelated call, almost bragging that he was, quote, handling the insurance thing myself. No need to worry about it. That's when the alarm bells started ringing quietly in the back of my head. From that point on, I kept a careful, quiet eye on Frank's handling of the fire claim. Not because he asked me to. He absolutely had not asked me to. But because I could smell disaster coming. The way you can smell rain before the first drop actually falls. I had to practically wrestle the proof of loss form out of him, just to make sure he hadn't botched the paperwork on something that basic. He had, almost. Small errors, the kind that insurers love to seize on to delay a payout by another 2 months. I caught them just in time and had him fix it. Then I gave him the warning that should have changed everything. The insurer's going to screw you. I told him, point blank, over the phone, no softening it. You don't know that, Frank said. I could hear it in his voice, That particular tone of a man who just wanted me off the line so he could get back to whatever he thought was more important. I'm paid to know when insurers are trying to screw my clients, I said, and they are stringing you along. Requests, questions, endless paperwork. That's not due diligence, Frank. That's a delay tactic. They have no intention of paying you unless you actually sue them. Frank brushed it off like lint off a jacket. He got along great with the adjuster. He told me it was all under control. He had a rapport with the guy. I pushed harder because something in my gut told me I needed to. The limitation period expires in 2 weeks. After that, it is over. You will not be able to sue, no matter how good your rapport is with that adjuster. They'll send you one final, polite email saying sorry, you're out of time, and that will be the entire end of it. Do not, under any circumstances, leave this to the last minute. Sure, fine, whatever, Frank said, already halfway checked out of the conversation. I've got this. Don't worry about it. I sent a follow-up email that same afternoon, spelling out the deadline in plain, unmissable language. He didn't reply. I sent it again a few days later, then again as the deadline crept closer. Then one final time, days before the limitation period expired, I wrote, I'm going to be in trial and unreachable for weeks, but you have to sue. Pick a firm, any firm, and sue before the deadline. Don't leave this to chance. Silence. Frank never answered a single one of those emails. I went off to trial. 2 weeks of 12-hour days. No bandwidth to think about Frank or his fire claim or anything outside the 4 walls of that courtroom. When I finally surfaced, a month had already passed. Then another month on top of that. Nothing from Frank. No calls, no emails, nothing. I remember actually feeling relieved about it. Maybe he pulled it together, I thought to myself. Maybe, for once, he actually listened to me. I was wrong. My phone rang one ordinary afternoon. It was Frank. Remember that fire insurance thing? He said, casual as anything, like we were discussing lunch plans for next Tuesday. We discussed it a dozen times, minimum. I braced myself, assuming he was calling to gloat about a payout finally coming through. So they paid out. I asked, That's great, Frank. Good for you, seriously. There was a pause on the other end, then confusion in his voice, real confusion. What are you talking about? Can I get a copy of the claim? Something cold settled in my stomach, right then, before he'd even finished the sentence. What claim? I said slowly. The claim against the insurer. You know, the one we talked about. Can you send it over to me? Frank, I said very carefully now. Did the insurer pay you? He hung up on me. Just like that, mid-conversation. A few minutes later, an email landed in my inbox from Frank. A rambling account of how we'd, quote, discussed this. How he'd, quote, told me to sue. And how he was, quote, just following up for a copy of a claim that, as far as I knew, had never actually been filed. I sat there staring at my screen for a long moment. Frank hadn't sued. The deadline had passed months ago. And now that a multi-million-dollar loss was sitting on his desk with seemingly no way to recover it, he was trying to rewrite history in real time and make it look like it was my failure, not his. That's the exact moment something shifted in me. Not rage, not exactly. Something colder and far more useful than rage. I thought about the old lawyer's warning from 15 years earlier. Clients will throw you under the bus without thinking twice. Frank was trying to do exactly that, in writing, with a timestamp. Here's the part Frank didn't know. The part that changed absolutely everything. Months earlier, when I first smelled disaster brewing on this file, I hadn't just warned Frank and walked away and washed my hands of it. I'd made him send me that proof of loss form, supposedly just to double-check his work. But I'd kept it filed away, just in case. And when the deadline crept close and Frank still hadn't budged an inch, I made a decision that most lawyers would tell you not to make. I filed a claim against the insurer myself, without instructions, without Frank's knowledge, just enough of a filing, using the limited information I already had on hand, to preserve the company's legal right to sue before that window slammed shut forever. Suing without a client's explicit instructions is not something lawyers do lightly, and for good reason. If it later turns out to be unnecessary or unwanted, the lawyer can be held personally, financially responsible for the other side's legal costs. It is a genuine risk, the kind that keeps you up at night. I did it anyway, quietly, and told absolutely no one. So when Frank's email landed in my inbox, trying to pin a catastrophic multimillion-dollar loss on me, I didn't panic. I didn't scramble. I did something better. I replied to his email, and I copied Frank's boss, and his boss's boss, and Bill, the company's in-house counsel, a man I'd worked with plenty and trusted to see things clearly. I take it the insurer didn't pay you, exactly as I warned you they wouldn't, and now that the limitation period has expired, they've told you to take a hike, leaving the company with a loss in the millions. Is that correct? Short, clean, devastating, and every word of it true. Bill called me within the hour. Didn't even wait for a reply email. Frank messed up. He said immediately, no defense, no hedging, no corporate spin. We know that. He's an idiot. What do we do? I could hear it in his voice, the barely controlled panic of a man who thought his company had just eaten a multi-million-dollar loss because of one stubborn employee's bruised ego. His excuses didn't hold up in the meeting? I asked, already suspecting the answer. Nope, Bill said. They'd already hauled Frank into a boardroom before making the call to me. He tried to spin a story about telling me to sue, about it somehow being my failure to follow through on his instructions, but it fell apart almost instantly under the slightest pressure. My warning emails, time-stamped, ignored, sitting right there in the record, told the real story with brutal clarity. And there was one simple, damning fact Frank couldn't explain his way around, no matter how he tried. If he had genuinely instructed me to sue, there would have been no reason for him to keep personally emailing back and forth with the insurer for weeks afterward. Once a file gets handed to legal counsel, the client's day-to-day involvement is supposed to end. Frank's continued involvement, all documented in his own emails, proved he'd never actually handed anything off at all. So that's it then, Bill said, bracing himself for the worst possible answer. We just lost a couple $1 million because Frank couldn't pick up a phone. I let the silence sit for exactly one beat before I answered him. It's okay, I said. When I realized Frank was going to drop the ball on this, I filed a claim to preserve the cause of action. It's rough, thin on details, but it's valid. We can amend it. Dead silence on the line for a second. Then, carefully, like he was almost afraid to believe it. You sued without instructions? Yes, I said. I sued without instructions. I pulled up the filing right there and sent it to him as we were still talking, the message landing in his inbox in real time, so he could see it with his own eyes. Thank God. Bill breathed out, and I could actually hear the relief physically leave his body through the phone. Can I leave this with you? Of course he could. The insurer was now, effectively, a sitting duck, caught having tried to run out the clock on a company that, thanks to one unauthorized filing made months earlier, still had every legal right to come after them for the full amount. I knew, without a shred of doubt in my mind, that we would collect. It was only a matter of time and paperwork from that point forward. A few days later, someone else from the company called me. Not Frank. Someone I'd never dealt with before in all my years working with them. I usually deal with Frank on this stuff, I said, a little confused. There was a short pause on the line. Frank doesn't work here anymore. They told me the rest, and I could picture it perfectly in my mind. Every detail. Frank called into a meeting first thing on a Monday morning, handed a single sheet of paper across the table, told, politely but firmly, to pack his desk. Security walking him past the co-workers he used to lecture about wasting money on lawyers, down the elevator in total silence, out into the parking lot, cardboard box balanced against his hip. He was close to 60 years old, not the kind of age where you simply bounce back into a comparable job at a comparable salary. It was, by any honest measure, a genuinely life-altering moment for him, and I won't pretend otherwise. I felt something when I heard the news. Not triumph, not exactly. Something closer to quiet vindication, settling in my chest. I hadn't set out to destroy Frank's career. I'd set out to protect myself, and by extension, protect a client who didn't deserve to lose millions of dollars because one man's ego wouldn't let him pick up a phone and ask for help. Frank did the rest of it entirely to himself, one ignored warning at a time, over a span of months, in writing, for anyone to see later. His replacement, by the way, turned out to be a completely different kind of person. Respectful, responsive, never once questioned an invoice or made me feel like I was picking his pocket for doing my job. Funny how that works out sometimes. There's a kind of justice that doesn't require any plotting or scheming or elaborate revenge fantasy. Sometimes all it takes is doing your job properly, documenting everything along the way, and refusing to let someone else's carelessness quietly become your problem. Frank didn't lose his career because I wanted revenge on him. He lost it because he ignored every single warning handed to him, over and over, for months. And in the end, the paper trail simply didn't lie. If this story gave you that quiet, satisfying feeling of watching karma finally do its job, let me know in the comments. Have you ever been blamed for someone else's mistake and come out on top anyway? Tell me about it. And if you want more stories exactly like this one, stick around, because there are plenty more where this came from.